Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
We need to raise kids to see that committing to one person is actually an enriching experience and something that can be jumped into enthusiastically.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello everybody, it's Dr. Justin Coulson. Welcome to the Happy Families podcast. Today Kylie couldn't be with me, unfortunately. That's life sometimes when we've got a big family and a whole lot of moving parts. But I'm really excited for the conversation that we're having. The consent conversation is not going away. Everybody knows by now about the petition that was started a couple of months ago by Chanel Contos, an Aussie expat living in the UK, but talking about the unwanted, non-consensual sexual activity that was occurring when she was a high school student at one of those ritzy schools in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. And of course, in the news since then, there's been really big stories around consent and unwanted sexual advances, primarily from males towards females in Parliament. We've seen major sports stars that have been in all sorts of strife in the courts because of it. And there was a news article on ABC. Actually, it wasn't a news article so much as an opinion article on the ABC website a couple of months ago that caught my attention. I thought that it was profoundly important, and it highlighted some pretty important cultural and societal paradigms that may explain a little bit about why we are where we are and what could be done about it. Just before we begin the podcast, I do need to highlight that the content, while not rated explicit, does deal with some fairly adult-only kinds of topics. We do recommend that people listen to the podcast with their children only if they're mature enough to take the content in. Otherwise, turn this one off and save it for a little bit later. Emma Wood holds a PhD in moral philosophy. She's a research fellow at Women's Forum Australia. She wrote an article that was on the ABC recently called The Significance of Sex, and Emma joins me to talk about that article and the consent conversation. Thanks for being here, Emma.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Emma, we have, as a society, in your article, two views of sex. Can you walk us through how society views sex today?
A contrast I was trying to draw in my article was between viewing sex as a recreational activity, where sex is really just a bodily function and the desire for sex is just the desire to scratch a bodily itch, versus what you might call a loftier view of sex, which I call the significance view, where you view sex as this precious, intimate experience of sharing the most intimate sphere of yourself with another person. And to view sex that way usually goes hand in hand with believing that it should be reserved for very special relationships, and that the most intimate physical act should be accompanied by an emotional intimacy and an emotional depth and commitment as well.
Emma, when I listen to you describe those two views, they're obviously polar opposites. We've got one, I remember the song by the Bloodhound Gang from the 1990s, You and Me, Baby, We Ain't Nothing But Mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel, that kind of, I guess, hookup culture. And I know that this particular culture exists. I don't get the sense that it's the dominant view of most people in society, even young people, although it's probably more predominant in a younger cohort. And then we've got the significance view, which I would usually associate with more of a conservative church-going kind of 1950s approach to sex. My guess, though, is that most people sit on a continuum somewhere between the two. And as we get older and involve ourselves in deeper and more meaningful relationships, I'd also guess that most people would tend towards the more significance view, even if they once held a recreational view. Do you have any sense of whether that would be an accurate picture or not?
I think, yes. I wouldn't necessarily agree that older people hold a more significance view of sex and younger people hold a more recreational view of sex. I think it has very much to do with the kind of philosophy and the kind of values and belief system a person has grown up with. Now, it's true that some young people maybe who have grown up in a religious or conservative household out of a sense of wanting to rebel might reject that. But I don't get the sense that it's neatly cut and dry along age lines like that. Some of the people that I hear from who are most committed to a recreational view are for want of a better word, your aging hippie types, your early baby boomers. Whereas I do talk to a lot of young people today who sense that something profound is missing from the cultural landscape in the discussion about sex. So I don't think it's quite as simple as that, but I think a person's philosophy and values.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about this recreational view of sex and this significance view of sex and what parents can do at a practical level to help their kids make safe, healthy and consensual decisions.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. Talking with Emma Wood, somebody who holds a PhD in moral philosophy and is a research fellow at Women's Forum Australia. Really fascinating discussion about consent and the way society views sexual interaction. Is it something that's just for recreation because, baby, it feels good? Or is it something far more significant that should only be reserved for very special and intimate relationships with people that, well, with maybe even with just one person or with as few people as possible because it matters so much. It's so significant. Emma, thanks again for what we're talking about. I've got a quick question for you about this recreational view of sex. Where does it come from? Because most parents that I talk to are pretty uncomfortable with the idea that their children would be chasing sex for the sake of going out and sowing their seeds, as the phrase used to be back in the olden days.
Where does it come from, the recreational view? In one sense, the recreational view has always been with us. We see throughout the history of thought, going all the way back to ancient Greece, that we had thinkers promoting various versions of the recreational view and the significance view. Of course, due to the timeless fact that sex makes babies, a purely recreational view of sex has always been somewhat impractical for most of human history. For most of the history of the West, the dominant view of sex has been that it ought to be reserved for the marriage relationship, this lifelong covenant of love and trust, which is the ideal rearing setting for children. What happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, however, is that certain intellectuals came to see this traditional marriage view as oppressive to the individual or to individual flourishing. So, while traditionalists view sexual desire as this desire for intimacy with another person, which fulfills a purpose of consummating a very special relationship, we have thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Alfred Kinsey and Wilhelm Reich who see sexual desire as just this depersonalised desire for a bodily sensation.
Emma, I'd love to ask you, because most parents don't want their children chasing a recreational view, now some are fine with it, but many parents really want their children to be careful, to be safe and healthy and make those intimate decisions as late as they can in life and with preferably as few people as possible. What can parents do at a practical level to help their children to make those safe, healthy, consensual choices?
There are 10 tips that I'd quickly like to give to help parents instill a higher view of sex. We can elaborate on any of these 10 tips, but I'll just run through each of them quickly. We'll see which one's most interesting. So number one, parents need to talk to their kids about sex early, often, and positively. Parents need to give kids good reasons and arguments for regarding sex as special, which go beyond your own say-so and beyond cheap scare tactics.
Yeah, that's something that I really emphasise when I talk to parents is we want to give kids a really positive view of sex, but the best sex that you have is in the context of an emotionally and socially and psychologically and even spiritually fulfilling relationship and partnership. It's not as wonderful, especially over the long haul, if it doesn't exist in that context. And there's increasingly data that would support that. What's the second idea?
So number two would be raise your kids to reject the individualistic model of relationships these days that tells people that we need to play the field before, quote, settling down. So we need to raise kids to see that committing to one person is actually an enriching experience and something that can be jumped into enthusiastically. So we do need to start helping our kids to think from an early age about what sort of person they want to end up with so that they can be in a good position to make a wise decision about this at a younger age than we believe is possible. That would be my second tip.
What's next?
And the third tip, give your kids dating tips. Now, part of the reason I think hookup culture is so prevalent is because I think it has become a comfort zone, with the result that many young people no longer know how to go on a proper traditional date.
Emma, my kids hate it when I give them dating tips. And I'm always telling them, when you go on a date, you don't have to kiss someone. You don't have to hold their hand. A date is for getting to know someone. It's about conversations. Yeah. And you can go on a date with one person one day and on a date with another person the next day, and you're not being a two-timer because you're not in a relationship with them. You're just going on a date. Yes, that's right.
I think if we get kids, without pressuring them and making them feel as if they have to make romantic relationships the be all and end all when they're really young, I think it does help to give kids tools, even though they may hate it and cringe. It does help to give kids tools that will help them to socialise in this way that used to come more easily to people. It's no use asking our kids to avoid hookup culture and casual sex if we have nothing interesting and positive to put in its place, right?
Right. And dating culture in Australia is almost absent. We have some friends in the US and they've got this elaborate dating culture. There's so much going on there, and it seems completely non-existent here in Australia. What's your next idea?
So number 4 would be to expose your kids to movies, music, art or literature that illustrates the beauty of romance and the significance of sex. You do need to give your kids good arguments, good science, good analogies to show why sex ought to be treated specially. But you also need to give them material that almost bypasses the rational side of the brain and elevates this vision of sex.
You're saying representation matters, right?
Representation matters.
What else?
Okay, so the next tip would be to shield your kids from pornography. This is a really important one. Sadly, the average age that kids first get exposed to hardcore internet porn these days is 11. Don't let your kids be one of those kids. Do whatever it takes. Have a work computer in the study that is only for parents, and a family computer in a public space that is for everyone else.
Yeah, we had a conversation with Melinda Tankard-Reist. We'll actually link to that in the show notes. She gave us some really important advice around kids and porn. I'm glad you raised that. What's your next one?
Cultivate in your daughters a confidence in their own worth, because most young girls are romantics by instinct. You just need to give them the confidence as parents to live up to their high romantic ideals. And cultivate in your sons the desire for chivalrous responsibility and a noble vision of masculinity.
Yeah, I really love that. But I could also imagine that in 2021 there'll be a whole bunch of people who are saying, that's so 1940s, that's so passé.
Well, I think I would just simply point those people to the consent crisis that we're having and remind people again that most of these problems are happening one way. Most of these problems are boys exploiting girls. So there has obviously been some failure to cultivate good men who have an awareness of their superior strength and therefore their responsibility to restrain that strength. So I think the consent crisis is all the evidence you need that there ought to still be a place for some kind of chivalry in the raising of our men.
What else have you got for us?
Next tip, be aware of the experiences, the negative experiences and negative influences that can derail kids, and be aware that many of these negative influences come from seemingly reputable authority figures and organisations. There are many groups going around schools right now talking about sexual consent, giving kids through their websites and sometimes through their talks that very casual view of sex that we talked about earlier. Not all organisations that present a reputable front are to be trusted, and so you need to be aware of that as parents. And lastly, most importantly, demonstrate the beauty of romance and monogamy and faithfulness through your own strong and loving marriage. I think this is the most important thing, because there is a lot of research that shows that kids who have a positive family experience and who experience the love and see the love of their parents, these are the sorts of kids who do avoid early sexual experience and who do wait and who are set on a more positive trajectory. So this last tip is a very important one. Let your kids see that you're in love.
Kiss in the kitchen in front of them, even when they go, oh, that's gross.
Dress up on date night and let them see you dressed up as you head out.
Love it. Emma, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you so much. Emma Wood holds a PhD in moral philosophy and is a research fellow at Women's Forum Australia, talking more about different perspectives and ways that we can help our children to navigate and manage some of the challenges associated with consent. We really hope that this podcast has given you food for thought and maybe inspired you in the conversations that you have with your kids. If you enjoy the podcast, we'd love those 5-star ratings and reviews to keep on coming. They help people to find the podcast to make their families happier. The podcast is produced all thanks to Justin Rulland from Bridge Media, and Craig Bruce is our executive producer. We've got I'll Do Better Tomorrow on Friday and a whole lot of other good stuff on the podcast to help your family be happier. Look forward to catching up with you on the podcast again tomorrow. In the meantime, if you'd like more info about making your family happy, you can get it all at happyfamilies.com.au.